August 16th, 2001, Phoenix, Arizona. FBI Special Agent Kenneth Williams sits at his desk, staring at a pattern that refuses to let him sleep. Over the past months, he's documented something unusual. Middle Eastern men with no prior aviation experience enrolling in American flight schools. Not to become commercial pilots, not to learn proper landings, just to steer, just to navigate, just the controls needed to aim a plane already in the air. Williams types up a memo. He titles it Zakaria Mustafa Subra, after one suspect, but the implications are far broader. He suggests the possibility that Osama bin Laden is sending students to the United States for flight training. He recommends a nationwide canvassing of flight schools. The memo is 5 pages, detailed, urgent. In our timeline, this memo went to FBI headquarters and died there, lost in bureaucratic channels, ignored warnings from a field agent who saw what others couldn't. 3 weeks later, 2,977 people would lose their lives and the world would change forever. But what if someone had listened? What if that memo reached the right desk at the right moment? What if the pieces scattered across a dozen agencies had been assembled just in time? What if the morning of September 11th, 2001 had been just another Tuesday? This is the story of the world that never knew 9/11. A world where intelligence succeeded instead of failed, where threats were neutralized before impact, where history pivoted on a memo that was read instead of filed away.
Historical context, the real warnings. To understand what could have happened, we need to understand what actually did happen, or rather, what didn't. By the summer of 2001, the United States intelligence community was receiving what they called chatter, increased communications suggesting something big was coming. CIA Director George Tenet would later describe the summer of 2001 as a time when the system was blinking red. On July 10, 2001, CIA counterterrorism chief Cofer Black gave a dramatic briefing to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. "We're going to be struck soon," he warned. "Many Americans are going to die." The threat reporting was as scary as anything seen since the millennium. But it was vague, no specifics, no actionable intelligence. Then there was the Phoenix memo. Agent Williams' detailed warning on July 10th. It specifically mentioned bin Laden. It specifically mentioned flight schools. It specifically suggested a coordinated effort. It went to 2 individuals at FBI headquarters. It was not shared with the CIA. It was not shared with the FAA. It was not acted upon. On August 6th, President Bush received his presidential daily brief while on vacation in Crawford, Texas. The title? Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. It mentioned FBI information indicating patterns of suspicious activity consistent with preparations for hijackings. It mentioned al-Qaeda members residing in the U.S. But again, it was vague on timing and targets. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, then San Diego, the CIA had been tracking 2 known al-Qaeda operatives, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. They'd attended a planning meeting in Kuala Lumpur in January 2000. The CIA knew they were dangerous. They watched them, then lost them, then found out they'd entered the United States. The CIA didn't tell the FBI until late August 2001. By then, the 2 men had been living openly in San Diego for over a year. They were in the phone book. They'd rented apartments in their real names. They'd taken flight lessons. In late August, FBI agent Steve Bongard, who was tracking the USS Cole bombing, learned about al-Midhar and al-Hazmi entering the U.S. He immediately understood the danger. He wanted to start a criminal investigation. He was told he couldn't because of the wall, legal restrictions between intelligence and criminal investigations. He sent an email to headquarters. Whatever has happened to this, someday someone will die and the public will not understand why we were not more effective. He sent that email on August 29, 2001, 13 days before the attacks. Then there was Zacharias Moussaoui, arrested in Minnesota on August 16th for immigration violations after his flight school instructors reported him for wanting to learn to fly a 747 but showing no interest in takeoffs or landings. Minneapolis FBI agents were convinced he was planning a hijacking. They wanted to search his laptop. FBI headquarters denied the request. Too thin, not enough probable cause. All the pieces were there. The Phoenix memo, the presidential daily brief, the two terrorists living openly in California, the suspicious student in Minnesota. The system was blinking red. But in our timeline, the pieces never came together. The agencies didn't communicate. The dots weren't connected. The bureaucracy won. 2,977 people died. The Twin Towers fell. The Pentagon burned. A field in Pennsylvania became a grave. And everything changed. But it didn't have to be that way.
Point of divergence, August 23, 2001. In our alternate timeline, one thing is different. One critical connection is made. August 23, 2001. FBI Deputy Director Tom Pickard is reviewing overnight intelligence summaries when something catches his eye. The Phoenix memo from Kenneth Williams has been forwarded to him by an assistant who cross-referenced it with the just-arrived information about al-Madar and al-Hazmi entering the United States. Two known al-Qaeda operatives in the country with flight connections, and a memo suggesting bin Laden might be sending people to flight schools. Pickard picks up the phone. He calls CIA Deputy Director John McLaughlin. "John, we need to talk, now." Within hours, a small task force assembles, FBI, CIA, FAA. They spread out the intelligence, the Phoenix observations, the Malaysia meeting attendees now in America, the presidential daily brief's warning, the increased chatter. Someone mentions the Minnesota case, the French-Moroccan who only wanted to steer, not land. The pattern emerges like a photograph developing in solution, not gradually, suddenly, all at once. Visual, intelligence photos and documents connecting with red string on a wall, suddenly forming a clear picture. They're going to hijack planes, multiple planes. They're going to use them as weapons. It's not a new idea. Project Bujinka in the Philippines in 1995 included plans to crash a plane into CIA headquarters. The intelligence community has gamed out such scenarios. But this feels different. This feels imminent. By August 25th, a nationwide canvassing of flight schools begins, quietly. The FAA issues a security directive, discreet but firm. Enhanced screening, heightened awareness, watch lists updated. Al-Madar and al-Hazmi are located in San Diego. FBI surveillance begins. More names emerge from their contacts. The network starts to reveal itself. On September 27, 2001, Zacharias Moussaoui's laptop is searched under emergency provisions. The contents are damning. Communications with overseas al-Qaeda contacts, references to flight planes, references to martyrdom. September 4, 2001, a coordinated operation launches. FBI raids in Boston, New Jersey, Florida, and California. 19 men are arrested. Some are on student visas, some are in the country illegally. All have connections to each other. All have taken flight training. None wanted to learn to land. In their apartments, box cutters, airline schedules, surveillance photos of airports, final letters to family members. The plot is disrupted. Attorney General Ashcroft holds a press conference on September 7, 2001. A major terrorist operation targeting aviation has been prevented. We believe we have averted a catastrophic attack. The arrests are front-page news for 2 days, then the news cycle moves on. Most Americans don't fully grasp what almost happened, how close it came. September 11, 2001 dawns as a normal Tuesday. Clear blue skies,
Morning routines, the Twin Towers stand, the Pentagon operates. Thousands of people go about their lives never knowing they were targeted, never knowing they were saved. In our timeline, this day became a wound in history. In this timeline, it's forgotten by September 13th. And that's where the real divergence begins, not in what happened, but in what didn't.
Part 1. The immediate aftermath, September to December 2001. In our reality, September 11th united America in grief and rage. The rebel was still smoking when politicians began speaking of war. Congress passed the authorization for use of military force on September 14th. Only one representative voted no. The Patriot Act followed on October 26th. Afghanistan was invaded on October 7th. The world transformed in weeks. In this timeline, the response is different, quieter, more uncertain. President Bush addresses the nation on September 9th after the arrests. American intelligence and law enforcement have successfully prevented a major terrorist attack, but this is a warning. We are at war with an enemy that hides in shadows. But without the emotional catalyst of 3,000 dead, without the images of the towers falling, the public response is muted. There's relief. There's congratulations for law enforcement. There's some fear, but there's no collective trauma, no burning desire for vengeance. Bush and his national security team still want action against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but they face a problem. It's much harder to rally support for war when the threat seems to have been handled. The Taliban, given an ultimatum, hand over Osama bin Laden and dismantle al-Qaeda or face military action. In our timeline, this ultimatum was rejected and mostly symbolic. War was already decided. In this timeline, it actually matters. The Taliban stall. They negotiate. They ask for evidence. Bush administration hardliners want to invade anyway. Colin Powell and the State Department push for coalition building, sanctions, diplomatic pressure. The debate drags through October and November. Meanwhile, the 19 captured terrorists are processed through the criminal justice system. Trials are scheduled, evidence is presented in court, some information becomes public. The scope of what was planned, multiple simultaneous hijackings, planes as weapons, potential targets including the World Trade Center and Pentagon, slowly emerges in testimony and court filings. Visual. Courtroom sketches, evidence bags, defendants in orange jumpsuits. Public awareness grows, but it's intellectual, not visceral. Americans read about what could have happened. They don't see it. They don't feel it. Poll numbers show majority support for action against al-Qaeda, but it's not overwhelming. It's not the 90% approval rating Bush had in our timeline. By December 2001, a limited military operation is launched in Afghanistan. CIA paramilitary teams, special forces, airstrikes, working with the Northern Alliance. The goal? Dismantle al-Qaeda training camps, kill or capture bin Laden and al-Qaeda leadership, pressure the Taliban. It's smaller than our timeline's invasion. There's no massive deployment of conventional forces, no rush to occupy. The mission is narrowly defined, counterterrorism, not nation-building. The operation is successful in disrupting al-Qaeda. Training camps are destroyed, mid-level operatives are killed or captured, but bin Laden escapes into Pakistan's tribal areas. The Taliban regime weakens but doesn't fall. A messy stalemate develops. Most importantly, there's no moment of national catharsis, no mission accomplished moment, no clear victory, just a continuation of what feels like a law enforcement operation with military support. As 2001 ends, Americans feel secure. The threat was caught. The system worked. Why worry?
Part 3. Civil Liberties and Surveillance. The Patriot Act that wasn't. Let's talk about what didn't happen at home. In our timeline, fear after 9/11 led to the USA Patriot Act, signed into law just 45 days after the attacks. It expanded government surveillance powers dramatically. Section 215 allowed the FBI to demand records from businesses without probable cause. Section 206 allowed roving wiretaps. The NSA's warrantless wiretapping program began. Privacy concerns were dismissed. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Critics were accused of not taking terrorism seriously. The debate was over before it started. In this timeline, the debate actually happens. After the September 2001 arrests, there are still calls for enhanced security measures. Attorney General Ashcroft proposes legislation similar to the Patriot Act. But without the emotional catalyst of thousands dead, Congress actually reads it. Civil liberties groups actually have time to respond. The public actually pays attention. Visual. Congressional hearing, split between those advocating for security and those for privacy. Some measures pass. Enhanced information sharing between CIA and FBI, that obvious gap is closed. Better coordination on terrorist watch lists. Increased funding for counterterrorism. These are uncontroversial. But the more invasive provisions face real opposition. Section 215 bulk data collection is rejected. The FISA court isn't given expanded rubber stamp powers. Warrantless wiretapping doesn't happen, or rather, doesn't happen legally with congressional approval. The debate becomes, how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for security? In our timeline, that question was answered in grief and fear. In this timeline, it's answered through actual democratic deliberation. The result is a middle ground, more security than pre-2001, but less surveillance than our timeline. The NSA still collects data, but under tighter restrictions. There are more checks, more oversight, more transparency. This has downstream effects. When Edward Snowden works at the NSA in this timeline, there's less to leak. The surveillance programs that do exist are more legally justified, less shocking when revealed. The Snowden revelations in 2013 still happen, but they're less explosive. The debate they spark is about degree, not kind. Airport security also develops differently. There's still enhanced screening after the 2001 plot. The FAA implements cockpit door reinforcement, better passenger screening, armed air marshals, but there's no Department of Homeland Security, no TSA as a massive federal agency. Security is enhanced, but not theatrical. You don't take off your shoes. There's no 3-ounce liquid rule. That came after a 2006 plot in our timeline, which might or might not happen here. The experience of flying is less degrading, less militarized. More importantly, there's no normalization of security theater. In our timeline, Americans got used to intrusive searches, surveillance cameras everywhere, see something, say something campaigns. We internalized the idea that we're always under threat, always being watched, and that this is normal. In this timeline, that normalization doesn't happen. Privacy remains a stronger cultural value. The idea that the government should be able to access your communications without a warrant remains controversial, not accepted. By 2025, the difference is stark. In our timeline, mass surveillance is assumed. Your phone tracks you, companies sell your data, government agencies can access vast troves of information. Most people have accepted this as the price of modern life. In this timeline, the privacy battles were fought and partially won. There are stronger legal protections, more transparency requirements, less data collection, or at least more regulated collection. The tech companies' business models are different. Without the post-9/11 acceptance of surveillance, Facebook and Google face more resistance to data harvesting. European GDPR-style regulations come to the US earlier. The Internet of 2025 is slightly less dystopian, slightly more respectful of privacy. It's not perfect. Governments and corporations still want data, but the cultural acceptance isn't there. The fight continues rather than being lost by default.
Part 4. The cultural shift that didn't happen. In our timeline, 9/11 wasn't just a political event. It was a cultural earthquake. It changed art, entertainment, language, and how Americans saw themselves and the world. The tone of American life shifted. From the relatively optimistic 1990s to a darker, more paranoid era. Movies got grittier. TV shows dealt with terrorism, torture, moral ambiguity. The ticking time bomb scenario, do you torture to get information, became a standard plot device. Islamophobia spiked. Hate crimes against Muslims, Sikhs, anyone perceived as Middle Eastern surged. Mosques were vandalized, people were attacked. The word Muslim became associated with terrorist in ways that still echo today. Immigration policy hardened. The border became militarized. Homeland security became a concern. The idea of America as a welcoming refuge dimmed. In this timeline, that shift is muted. September 2001 still happens. The plot is still revealed.
There's still awareness that Islamic terrorism is a threat, but without the visceral trauma, without the images of people jumping from buildings, without the funerals and the memorials, the emotional response is different. There are still hate crimes against Muslims after the arrests. There's still suspicion, but it's more comparable to the post-Oklahoma City bombing response. Concern about a specific threat, not a civilizational clash. Muslim Americans face discrimination, but not the systemic othering that occurred post-9/11. Cultural products reflect this. There's no 24-hour Jack Bauer torturing terrorists and being celebrated for it. Homeland security thriller genre is smaller. The moral certainty of good versus evil that defined post-9/11 entertainment is less prevalent. Instead, the culture of the late 1990s continues with modifications. The optimism is tempered, but not shattered. The irony and self-reference of the pre-9/11 era doesn't die. We don't get the grim dark turn that defined the 2000s. Visual, split screen of movie posters, gritty war films on one side, lighter fare on the other. Politics is different too. In our timeline, 9/11 created a hawkish consensus that lasted years. Criticizing the war on terror was seen as unpatriotic. Democrats and Republicans competed to be tougher on terrorism. Civil liberties advocates were marginalized. In this timeline, the political spectrum is wider. There's still a center-right consensus on security, but there's actual debate. The anti-war left isn't delegitimized. The neoconservative moment is smaller. The Bush administration's aggressive foreign policy faces real opposition. This changes the Obama presidency. In our timeline, Obama ran as the anti-Bush, particularly on Iraq. His opposition to that war defined his 2008 campaign. In this timeline, Obama still runs, but on different grounds. Economic populism, healthcare, climate change get more focus. He likely still wins in 2008. The financial crisis still happens, we'll get to that, but his presidency is different. There's no Afghanistan surge to decide about, no Iraq withdrawal to manage, no ISIS to contain. Foreign policy isn't dominated by managing Bush's wars. The Tea Party still emerges, but its focus is more purely economic and cultural, less tied to frustration with endless wars. The dynamic that leads to Trump's 2016 victory is altered. Would Trump still win? That's complex. Much of his 2016 appeal was about America first, ending endless wars, banning Muslims. In a timeline without the Iraq war quagmire, without the ISIS-fueled fear, his message has less resonance, but the economic anxiety and cultural grievance remain. Let's say the 2016 election is closer. Maybe Hillary wins. Maybe Trump still pulls it off on pure populism. Either way, the presidency is less militarized, less about terrorism, more about traditional political divisions. By 2025, American political culture is less dominated by security concerns. The past 24 years haven't been defined by war and terrorism. They've been defined by the financial crisis, climate change, technology, inequality, real issues that didn't get the attention they deserved in our timeline because terrorism sucked all the oxygen out of the room.
Part 5. The Financial Crisis and the Wars that Obscured It. Here's something crucial. The 2008 financial crisis still happens in this timeline. The housing bubble, the subprime mortgages, the derivatives, the collapse of Lehman Brothers. None of that was caused by 9/11 or prevented by its absence. But the response is different, and that changes everything. In our timeline, when the crisis hit, America was exhausted. 7 years of war, trillions spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. The military and public attention stretched thin. The financial crisis was seen as one more disaster in a decade of disasters. The bailouts happened, but the public was too tired to really fight. The Occupy Wall Street movement emerged, but didn't have the energy to sustain itself. Americans were numb. In this timeline, the financial crisis is the defining trauma of the decade. Without 9/11 and Iraq overshadowing everything, the collapse of the financial system gets the full attention it deserves. The public outrage is more focused. Why are we bailing out banks? Why aren't executives going to jail? Why is Main Street suffering while Wall Street gets rescued? Visual. Occupy protests, but larger, more sustained, signs demanding justice. The political response is different. In our timeline, the crisis helped elect Obama, but his administration was still managing wars and terrorism. In this timeline, economic justice becomes the singular focus. The 2009 stimulus is larger. Bank regulations are tougher. There's more appetite for breaking up too-big-to-fail banks. Elizabeth Warren's influence grows earlier. The Dodd-Frank Act has more teeth. Criminal prosecutions of Wall Street executives happen. Not many, but some. The message that white-collar crime has consequences actually lands. The recovery is still slow. That's baked into the nature of financial crises. But there's less sense that the system is rigged beyond repair. There's more belief that reform is possible. The Tea Party still emerges in 2009, but it's more focused on the bank bailouts and less on Obama's supposed foreign policy weakness or the culture war. The populist anger at elites is channeled more toward economic issues that change the 2010s. Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign has even more resonance. The Democratic Party moves left on economics more quickly. The debate about inequality, healthcare, and worker power dominates instead of being secondary to terrorism concerns. By 2025, the economic landscape is slightly different. Banks are more regulated. Inequality is still severe, but the political system has been more responsive. The sense that government can actually address economic problems is stronger. Crucially, the multi-trillion-dollar cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars doesn't exist. That money, estimated at $8 trillion in our timeline when you include long-term costs, is partially available for other uses. Not fully, because deficits still matter politically, but partially. Infrastructure gets more investment. The social safety net is stronger. Climate change gets more attention and resources. The future is funded rather than mortgaged for wars.
Part 6. Technology and Innovation, the Butterfly Effects. Technology always develops in context. The technological landscape of 2025 in this timeline is subtly but significantly different from ours. First, the direct effects. In our timeline, post-9/11 security concerns drove massive investment in surveillance technology, biometrics, data analysis, drones. The war on terror was a laboratory for new technologies. Many of the tools that now dominate civilian life, advanced facial recognition, predictive algorithms, drone technology, were developed or accelerated by military and security applications. In this timeline, that investment is much smaller. Security technology still advances, but it's not the overwhelming priority. The billions that went to defense contractors for counterterrorism tools go elsewhere or don't get spent at all. Drone technology develops more slowly. In our timeline, armed drones became central to counterterrorism operations. By 2025, drone warfare is normalized. Targeted killings by drone are routine. The technology has also spread to civilian applications. Amazon delivery drones, surveillance drones, photography drones. In this timeline, drones exist but are less advanced and less ubiquitous. The military investment that accelerated the technology isn't there. Civilian drones are more regulated because they weren't normalized by military use first. Facial recognition technology is less advanced. In our timeline, this tech was driven by security needs, identifying terrorists, tracking suspects, screening crowds. In this timeline, it develops mainly for commercial purposes and faces more privacy restrictions. The smartphone revolution still happens. The iPhone still launches in 2007, but some features are different. The integration of biometric security, fingerprints, facial recognition, happens later because the underlying technology is less advanced. The assumption that your phone should track your every movement is less accepted. Social media develops similarly. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube all exist, but the business model is slightly different. Without post-9/11 normalization of surveillance, there's more resistance to data collection. Privacy-focused alternatives have more market share. The internet is slightly less centralized around a few giant platforms. Artificial intelligence and machine learning still advance, but they're less focused on pattern recognition for security purposes, more on commercial and research applications. The ethical debates about AI come earlier because there isn't a "but we need it for terrorism" trump card shutting down concerns. Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology develop on a similar timeline. These weren't driven by 9/11 or terrorism. Bitcoin still emerges in 2009 as a response to the financial crisis, but the regulatory approach is different. Without the "we must prevent terrorist financing" argument, crypto faces less existential regulatory threat, but also less libertarian appeal as a bulwark against government overreach. Second, the indirect effects through economic allocation. The trillions spent on war in our timeline weren't spent on research, education, infrastructure, or commercial innovation. While military spending can drive technological advancement, it's usually less efficient than direct civilian investment. In this timeline, with more resources available, there's more public investment in fundamental research. The National Science Foundation and NIH have larger budgets. Space exploration gets more funding. NASA isn't competing as much with defense priorities. This might mean fusion energy research is further along. Renewable energy gets more investment earlier. Material science, quantum computing, biotechnology all advance faster with more stable, consistent funding. By 2025, the technological landscape isn't radically different. The underlying scientific principles are the same, but the priorities are shifted. Less surveillance, more efficiency and sustainability. Privacy more valued. Innovation more evenly distributed rather than security-dominated. The tech industry itself is different culturally. In our timeline, Silicon Valley's relationship with the national security state grew close post 9/11. Google, Facebook, Amazon all worked extensively with intelligence agencies and defense contractors. This was controversial but normalized. In this timeline, that relationship is more contested. Tech workers are more likely to protest military contracts. Companies face more pressure to prioritize ethics over security contracts. The culture of move fast and break things faces more resistance because it wasn't merged with "we're fighting terrorism." By 2025, technology is slightly more democratized, slightly more ethical, slightly less dystopian. Not perfect, not utopian, but better.
Part 2. The Wars That Didn't Happen, 2002-2003. In our timeline, 9/11 created political space for dramatic action. The Bush administration, already inclined toward aggressive foreign policy, had public support to do almost anything. The Iraq War planning began within days of September 11th. The War on Terror became an organizing principle for American foreign policy. In this timeline, that space doesn't exist. 2002 begins with the Afghanistan operation continuing in a limited capacity. There are debates about staying or leaving, but neither side is passionate. Bin Laden is still at large, but the immediate threat seems contained. Most al-Qaeda leadership is dead, captured, or in hiding. Then the Bush administration pivots to Iraq. In our timeline, this pivot happened easily. The emotional aftermath of 9/11 combined with misleading intelligence about WMDs created a context where invading Iraq seemed logical to many Americans. Congress approved military action in October 2002. The invasion launched in March 2003. In this timeline, it's a much harder sell. Without 9/11, there's no atmosphere of fear and vulnerability. Vice President Cheney and Defense Secretary Rumsfeld make the case. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. He's a threat. We need to act. But the public is skeptical. Why now? What's the connection to terrorism? The intelligence on WMDs is questioned more aggressively. UN weapons inspectors are actually given time to work. They find nothing. France, Germany, and Russia oppose military action. Without the post-9/11 unity, their opposition carries more weight.
By mid-2003, there's no Iraq war. Saddam Hussein remains in power, isolated but unthreatened. This has massive ripple effects. First, no insurgency. In our timeline, the Iraq War killed hundreds of thousands, created millions of refugees, and destabilized the entire region. ISIS emerged from the chaos of post-invasion Iraq. None of this happens. Second, different U.S. military positioning. Without wars in Iraq and Afghanistan consuming resources, the U.S. military isn't stretched thin. There's no surge, no endless deployments. Military families aren't broken by repeated tours. The VA isn't overwhelmed. Third, different political landscape. The Iraq War became a defining issue. It destroyed Bush's second term. It propelled Obama to the presidency. In this timeline, Bush's 2004 re-election campaign is about the economy, not war. John Kerry runs on domestic issues. The election is closer. Bush wins, but narrowly. His second term focuses on privatizing Social Security, a push that fails and weakens his presidency. Without war to distract, domestic failures loom larger. Fourth, different Middle East. Saddam Hussein continues his brutal rule but remains contained. Iran doesn't gain the regional influence it did after Saddam's removal. The Sunni-Shia balance in the region is different. Saudi Arabia and Iran remain rivals but not in the proxy war configuration that developed post-Iraq war. Most significantly, there's no ISIS. The Islamic State emerged from the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, fueled by Sunni resentment of the Shia-led government installed after the invasion. Without the invasion, without the disbanding of the Iraqi army, without the chaos, ISIS doesn't form. The Syrian civil war, beginning in 2011, still happens, but without ISIS exploiting the vacuum, it unfolds differently. There's still horror, still displacement, but different horror, different displacement. By 2008, the American military hasn't been at war constantly for 7 years. There's no endless war fatigue, no sense that America is stuck in unwinnable conflicts. The military is smaller, more focused on conventional deterrence rather than counterinsurgency. Terrorism still exists. Al-Qaeda still launches attacks, the 2004 Madrid bombings, the 2005 London bombings. But the Western response is different, more measured, more like law enforcement and intelligence operations, less like total war.
Part 8. Climate Change, the fight that could have started earlier. Here's one of the most significant divergences: climate change policy. In our timeline, the 2000s were a lost decade for climate action. The Bush administration rejected Kyoto. Post 9/11, attention and resources went to terrorism and war. Climate change was a secondary concern at best, a liberal hoax at worst. By the time Obama took office in 2009, the problem was more urgent, but the political capital had been spent on wars. The Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill passed the House in 2009, but died in the Senate. Copenhagen Climate Summit that year produced weak commitments. Paris Agreement didn't come until 2015. In this timeline, the 2000s aren't dominated by war. Climate change remains on the agenda. Gore versus Bush in 2000 still happens. Bush still wins. That was decided by Supreme Court, not terrorism. But without 9/11 reshaping his presidency, Bush faces more pressure on climate. The Kyoto Protocol, rejected by the U.S. in our timeline, gets a second look. Bush still doesn't sign it. That's baked into Republican ideology. But the debate continues. States like California move forward with their own regulations. The political space exists for climate conversation. Visual. Graphs showing CO2 emissions trajectories, our timeline versus alternate timeline, slight divergence. When the Democrats retake Congress in 2006, this still happens due to Bush's domestic failures. They actually focus on climate legislation, not as a side project while managing wars, but as a priority. By 2008, when Obama, or possibly another Democrat, wins, there's momentum. The 2009 stimulus includes massive clean energy investment, larger than in our timeline because there is no war spending competing for resources. Cap and trade passes the Senate by a narrow margin in 2010. It's not perfect, but it's something. The 2010s see more consistent climate policy. The U.S. participates more actively in international negotiations. The Paris Agreement comes earlier and with stronger commitments. China and India, seeing U.S. leadership, are more willing to commit. Renewable energy investment is higher throughout the 2010s. Grid infrastructure gets upgraded earlier.
Electric vehicle adoption accelerates, not because the technology is different, but because policy supports it more consistently. By 2025, global emissions are lower than in our timeline. Not dramatically. We're still dealing with China's coal addiction, India's development needs, political resistance, but measurably lower. Maybe 5 to 10% less cumulative emissions over 25 years. That doesn't sound like much, but in climate terms, it's significant. Global temperature rise is slightly slower. Extreme weather events are slightly less severe. The tipping points are slightly farther away. More importantly, the political debate is different. In our timeline, terrorism and war created a permanent present tense mentality. Everything was urgent, immediate, reactive. Long-term planning for climate change requires the opposite, delayed gratification, thinking generations ahead. In this timeline, without constant crisis, that's slightly more possible.
Part 9. The Global Order. America's Role Redefined. In our timeline, 9/11 and the War on Terror defined American foreign policy for a generation. The U.S. spent trillions on war, sacrificed thousands of lives, lost international credibility through torture and endless conflict, and ultimately withdrew from Afghanistan in chaos in 2021. By 2025, America's global position is weaker than it was in 2001. China has risen. Russia is aggressive. U.S. allies question American reliability. The unipolar moment of the 1990s is over. In this timeline, the trajectory is different. Without spending $8 trillion on wars, the U.S. economy is stronger in 2025. The debt-to-GDP ratio is lower. There's more fiscal space for infrastructure, R&D, education, investments that strengthen long-term competitiveness. U.S. military credibility is also higher because it wasn't squandered in failed occupations. The military is smaller but more respected. There's no forever war fatigue. When America threatens military action, it carries weight because it hasn't been overused. Visual, military parade, disciplined and focused, not exhausted. International relations are better. The Iraq War damaged U.S. alliances profoundly. France, Germany, Turkey all opposed it. The gap between America and Europe widened. Relations with the Muslim world hit historic lows. In this timeline, those breaches don't happen. NATO is stronger. European allies trust American judgment more. The Muslim world still has grievances with U.S. policy, but they're specific. Israel-Palestine, support for authoritarian regimes, rather than existential, occupation of Muslim lands, torture at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. China's rise still happens. That's driven by internal reforms and global economic integration starting in the 1990s. By 2025, China is still a major power, still challenging U.S. dominance in Asia, still pursuing Belt and Road. But the U.S. is better positioned to compete. More resources, more credibility, better allies. The pivot to Asia that Obama attempted in our timeline happens earlier and more effectively in this timeline. The U.S.-China relationship is competitive but more managed. There's still tension over Taiwan, South China Sea, technology, human rights. But without America distracted by Middle East wars, the focus on Asia has been more consistent. Russia under Putin still becomes authoritarian and aggressive. The Georgia invasion in 2008 and Crimea annexation in 2014 likely still happen. Those were driven by Putin's worldview and Russia's security concerns, not by U.S. actions in the Middle East. But European responses are stronger because European militaries and political will haven't been depleted by Iraq and Afghanistan. NATO expansion in the 2000s proceeds more confidently. Ukraine gets more support earlier. Would the 2022 Ukraine invasion still happen? That's complex. Putin's decision was multi-causal, but a stronger NATO, a less distracted U.S., and a Ukraine that had more support in the 2010s might have deterred the invasion or created different dynamics. At minimum, if Russia does invade, Western response is stronger because there's less war fatigue and more military readiness. The rise of populism and nationalism in the 2010s to 2020s still happens. That's driven by economic inequality, cultural anxiety, social media. Brexit still occurs. European far-right parties still gain ground. But the specific form is different. In our timeline, terrorism and migration fears were central to populist appeals. They're invading us. Muslims want Sharia law. In this timeline, those fears are muted. Populism is more about economics, sovereignty, cultural change. Still divisive, but less wrapped in existential security fears. The multilateral order, UN, WTO, international law, is slightly stronger. In our timeline, the U.S. violated international law invading Iraq, used torture, operated black sites. This damaged the credibility of international norms. In this timeline, while American power is still self-interested, it's less openly contemptuous of rules. By 2025, the global order is still contested, still multipolar, still facing the same challenges: climate, inequality, technology governance, pandemic response. COVID still happens. That's biological, not political. But it's slightly more functional, slightly more rules-based, slightly less chaotic. America is not the hegemon of 2001, but it's a more respected, more effective leader than in our timeline. The soft power squandered through torture and failed wars is instead preserved. The lives lost in endless deployment are saved and productive.
Part 10. The lives that were lived. Let's make this concrete. Let's talk about individual human lives that are different. In our timeline, nearly 3,000 people died on September 11, 2001. Their absence echoes through decades. Children who grew up without parents, spouses who grieved, communities that lost firefighters, business leaders, immigrants pursuing dreams. Those lives ended. In this timeline, they lived. The stockbroker who would have died in the North Tower instead retires in 2015, watches grandchildren grow. The firefighter who would have rushed into the South Tower instead serves until 2020, retires with full pension. The flight attendant who would have been on American 11 instead flies for another decade, sees her daughter graduate college. 2,977 people who died on 9/11 in our timeline. Another 2,977 people who died afterward from toxic dust exposure at Ground Zero. First responders, recovery workers, residents. Nearly 6,000 people who lived instead. Then the wars. Approximately 7,000 U.S. service members killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tens of thousands more with permanent injuries. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi and Afghan civilians killed. Over 1 million people dead from direct war violence, many more from indirect effects, displacement, disease, societal collapse. In this timeline, most of those people lived. The Marine who would have died in Fallujah in 2004 instead completes a service, uses the GI Bill, becomes a teacher. The Afghan wedding party that would have been hit by a drone strike in 2009 instead exists, lives their lives. Good and bad, normal. The Iraqi child who would have lost parents to sectarian violence instead grows up in a repressive but stable dictatorship, experiences the chaos of the Arab Spring uprising, survives to see a messy but endurable future. Visual. Montage of ordinary moments. Families eating dinner, graduations, weddings, quiet domesticity. The American soldier who would have done 4 tours in Afghanistan, coming back with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, struggling with VA bureaucracy, ending up homeless. In this timeline, he does 1 tour in the limited 2001-2002 operation and comes home. It's not easy, but it's manageable. He holds a job, stays married, raises kids. The translator who worked with U.S. forces in Kabul, fearing Taliban revenge, spending years trying to get a special immigrant visa, finally evacuating in chaos in 2021, in this timeline, he never faces that terror. He lives in Afghanistan under a messy but not genocidal regime. The Syrian family that fled war and ISIS, spent years in Turkish refugee camps, attempted the Mediterranean crossing, lost a child to drowning. In this timeline, Syria is still at war,
But without ISIS, without the totality of collapse, they stay. Their son lives. The Muslim American teenager growing up in the 2000s who faced bullying, discrimination, hate crimes, constant suspicion. In this timeline, she faces prejudice, but not the systematic othering. She doesn't have to explain herself constantly. She's just American. The TSA agent who spent 20 years in a job that exists only because of security theater, low-paid and dehumanizing, in this timeline, that job doesn't exist. She does something else with her life, something more fulfilling. The defense contractor who made millions building systems for Iraq and Afghanistan, becoming wealthy from war, in this timeline, he makes a comfortable living but not a fortune, and society doesn't bear the cost of enriching him. The journalist who covered the wars became cynical, burned out, traumatized by what he witnessed. In this timeline, he covers other stories, some tragic, some hopeful. He retires without nightmares of children killed by airstrikes. The parent who sent a child to war and got back a flag, in this timeline, they argued about politics, saw their kid get married, became grandparents. These aren't abstractions. These are lives. In our timeline, 9/11 and its aftermath killed roughly 2 million people when you count direct and indirect deaths. In this timeline, most of them lived. Not perfect lives. Not lives free from suffering. Life includes suffering. But lives. Continued existence. The chance to love, work, fail, succeed, try again. That's what the successful prevention of 9/11 meant. Not just avoided destruction, not just different politics. Lives. Hundreds of thousands of continued human lives.
Closing reflection, the fragility of everything. So here we are, 2025, in a world where 9/11 didn't happen, where intelligence agents connected dots just in time, where 19 men were arrested instead of boarding planes, where thousands lived instead of died. It's not utopia. The financial crisis still devastated millions. Climate change still threatens the future. Inequality still divides societies. Authoritarian regimes still oppress. Terrorism still exists. Wars still happen. But it's better. Measurably, meaningfully better. Trillions of dollars spent on human welfare instead of war. Hundreds of thousands of lives lived instead of lost. Civil liberties less eroded. Alliances stronger. Long-term challenges like climate change receiving more attention and resources. The question this alternate history poses is uncomfortable. How much of the last 24 years of suffering was necessary? How much was chosen? In our timeline, we tell ourselves that 9/11 was inevitable, that the system couldn't have caught it, that the failures were understandable, that what followed, the wars, the torture, the surveillance, the trillion-dollar price tag, was necessary to prevent worse. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The warnings were there. The Phoenix memo, the presidential daily brief, the CIA's knowledge of al-Midhar and al-Hazmi, the arrest of Moussaoui, all the pieces scattered across agencies that didn't communicate. It wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. It came down to a memo being read or ignored, a phone call being made or not made, bureaucratic walls being breached or remaining intact. And once it happened, what followed wasn't inevitable either. The Iraq War was a choice. The torture regime was a choice. The creation of Guantanamo was a choice. The erosion of civil liberties was a choice. The trillion-dollar forever wars were choices. We could have chosen differently. In small moments, through small actions, history could have pivoted. That's the lesson of this alternate timeline. Not that we should live in regret. We can't change what happened, but that we should understand the future is not fixed. The crises we face are not all inevitable. The suffering we accept is often chosen, consciously or unconsciously, through action or inaction.
Right now, in 2025, we face new crises: climate change, inequality, democratic erosion, artificial intelligence risks, pandemic threats, nuclear dangers. None of these are inevitable. None are unsolvable. The question is, will we be the agents who connect the dots, who make the phone calls, who read the memos, who choose differently? Or will we be the ones who file the warnings away, who don't communicate across divisions, who let bureaucracy triumph over urgency, who accept catastrophe as inevitable when it's merely likely? History turns on such moments, on small decisions made by ordinary people doing their jobs, on pieces of information shared or siloed, on patterns recognized or ignored. Kenneth Williams wrote a memo on July 10, 2001. In our timeline, it wasn't enough. In another timeline, it was. What memo are we ignoring right now? What pattern are we failing to see? What warning is sitting on someone's desk waiting to be read? The world where 9/11 was stopped reminds us prevention is possible. Different choices are available. Better futures exist if we're willing to fight for them in the small, unglamorous ways that actually matter. Communication, diligence, courage to speak up, willingness to listen. We don't get to live in the world where 9/11 never happened. We live in the world it created. But we can learn from the alternate path. We can choose better for the next crisis, the next warning, the next moment when history hangs in the balance. Because it always does. In every moment, in every decision, in every memo read or filed away. The towers fell in our world. They stood in another. The difference was human choice. What will we choose next?
Part 7. The Middle East, Different Chaos. Let's return to the region where this all began. What does the Middle East of 2025 look like without the Iraq War, without massive U.S. military presence, without ISIS? First, Iraq. Saddam Hussein remains in power through the 2000s. His regime is brutal, authoritarian, isolated. Economic sanctions continue, but weaken over time as international resolve fades. By the early 2010s, sanctions are mostly lifted in exchange for allowing weapons inspectors. Saddam ages. He's 75 by 2012. Questions about succession arise. His sons Uday and Qusay, both killed during the 2003 invasion, maneuver for power. The regime is brittle, repressive, but stable in the way authoritarian regimes can be stable. Then comes the Arab Spring in 2011. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria all erupt. In our timeline, Iraq was still occupied and chaotic. In this timeline, the wave hits Iraq too. Protests in Baghdad, Basra, Kurdish regions. Saddam's response is characteristically brutal. Crackdowns, massacres. But the regime is old, tired, undermanned. The military is less loyal after decades of sanctions and isolation. By the 2012, Iraq has a civil war, but it's different from our timeline's sectarian warfare post-invasion. It's more straightforward, regime versus opposition. The Kurds use the opportunity to establish de facto independence. Shiites in the south rebel with Iranian support. Sunnis are divided between regime loyalists and reformers. The U.S. provides support to opposition groups but doesn't invade. This is 2012, after the financial crisis, after Afghanistan has shown the limits of nation-building. There's no appetite for another ground war. Saddam falls in 2013, possibly killed in the fighting. Iraq fragments. A messy partition with Kurdish autonomy, a Shiite south with Iranian influence, a Sunni center. It's chaotic, but localized. The sectarian militias that became ISIS in our timeline emerge, but without the unique conditions of foreign occupation and total state collapse, they don't coalesce into a territorial caliphate. Visual. Map of Middle East with altered borders, fragmented territories. Syria's civil war still happens, beginning in 2011, but without ISIS exploiting the chaos, it's different. Still horrific, Assad still uses chemical weapons, Russia still intervenes. But the theater of war is simpler.
regime versus rebels versus Kurds, not the multi-sided nightmare with ISIS controlling a third of the country. The refugee crisis is smaller, still tragic, still millions displaced, but fewer than our timeline's 5 million Syrian refugees. Europe faces migration pressures, but not the 2015-2016 crisis that empowered far-right parties. Iran's regional position is complicated. In our timeline, removing Saddam gave Iran enormous influence in Iraq. In this timeline, Iraq's fragmentation gives Iran influence in the Shiite south, but not control of the whole country. Iran is strong, but not dominant. The Saudi-Iran rivalry continues, but takes different forms. No Yemeni civil war proxy fight. That was partly driven by Iran's post-Iraq confidence and Saudi alarm. Lebanon's political dynamics are different. Hezbollah is still powerful, but less so without the regional chaos to exploit. Israel-Palestine remains tragically unresolved. This conflict has its own logic, largely independent of Iraq or ISIS. The Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, still happens. The Gaza blockade still develops. Settlements expand. The two-state solution remains elusive. But without the war on terror framing everything, the Israel-Palestinian conflict gets more attention as a distinct issue rather than being subsumed into a broader clash of civilizations narrative. International pressure on Israel is slightly stronger. The BDS movement gains traction earlier. U.S. policy is less reflexively pro-Israel because American politics aren't as dominated by terrorism fears. By 2025, there's no resolution, but the dynamics are different. The conflict is seen more as a humanitarian and political issue, less as part of an existential battle between Islam and the West. Afghanistan remains a complicated story. Remember, there was still a limited U.S. operation there in this timeline. By 2010, that operation winds down. The Taliban haven't been fully defeated, but have been weakened. A messy power-sharing government emerges, part Taliban, part Northern Alliance, part Western-backed officials. It's not democracy. It's not justice, but it's not the 20-year occupation of our timeline either. When the U.S. fully withdraws in 2012, the country doesn't immediately collapse because it was never fully conquered and occupied. The Taliban control rural areas, the government controls cities. It's the historical Afghan pattern, fragmented, tribal, unstable, but functional in its own way. Crucially, no American soldiers die in Afghanistan after 2012. The 20-year war that killed over 2,000 U.S. troops and tens of thousands of Afghans just doesn't happen. The generational trauma of endless deployment doesn't exist. Libya's 2011 intervention still happens, that was driven by the Arab Spring and European concerns, not by the 9/11 aftermath. Gaddafi falls. Libya descends into chaos. This creates migration pressures and instability, but without ISIS exploiting the vacuum, it's more contained. Al-Qaeda still exists in 2025, but is a weakened network rather than the central organizing force of global jihad. They still inspire attacks, Madrid, London, others, but they never become the existential threat they seem to be post 9/11. They're more comparable to other terrorist organizations, dangerous but manageable through intelligence and law enforcement. The Middle East of 2025 in this timeline is still troubled, still authoritarian in most places, still wrestling with the same sectarian economic and political problems. But it's not defined by the U.S. presence. It's not shaped by the cascading catastrophe of the Iraq War. It's chaotic in its own authentic ways, rather than chaos imposed by foreign intervention. And crucially, a generation of Americans and Middle Easterners haven't spent their entire adult lives at war with each other.